Let's bring in someone who was there yesterday, and that's Chris Johnston of NorthStar Bets. Chris, what was your read, or what is your read on Dubas's future with the Leafs?
Well, it's very murky. It's tough to have any sense of clarity on where things are going. And it was a surprise, quite frankly, to hear Kyle Dubas, at least for a day, openly muse about the possibility that, he might not continue on as his own choice as a general manager of the Maple Leafs, mentioning that in recent days, he's, come to learn of how difficult this season was on his family. He's married with two young children. And so, it seems like the ball is in his court, at least at this point in time. And that was a pretty stunning revelation. I think it was a really honest, heartfelt press conference from Kyle Dubas, talking about his views on the team, his willingness to potentially trade any of the star players and having to go in a different path. And really the first domino to fall in the next day or two, I would think, is whether he himself will be the one calling the shots or if the Leafs are going to be looking for a new general manager.
CJ, I mean, he was emotional, no doubt about it. But could it be also that he was just pissed off with his team? A tough year. It obviously weighed in his family. The core that he's just had so much loyalty towards didn't show up for certain games and important series. He's just an angry man right now, which might not be the worst thing for a GM to be in a season that perhaps change is demanded.
Well, he is an emotional guy. And that if you only just see a picture of him in the glasses looking ponderous, you might not recognize that. But if you spend time around Kyle Dubas, I think even some of the things we saw in this playoff series, whether it was getting into the fans a little bit or throwing a water bottle in frustration in his press box suite, I mean, that is reflective of how competitive he is, how badly he wants to win, how much he cares about the people that work for him and with him. And so I think all possibilities are on the table here. Really only he knows what's going on. I mean, that's what strikes me is that, in the comments he made Monday to reporters, I think came as a surprise to a lot of people that work with him on a daily or near daily basis, that they didn't know all that was going on underneath the surface. I think it's quite common, right? We all have a work and professional life, and there's often things going on behind the scenes that only those closest to you know about. And those sort of came to the surface. So, I think after a season as trying as this one, a year in which, remember, Leafs ownership declined to give him a contract extension last summer. And so throughout this year, he'd been managing and working with an uncertain future. Obviously, a lot of stakes riding on the outcome of the team, a lot of hours and stress go into the kind of job he has. I think it's possible that he's a little burnt out, a little emotionally spent, a little angry. I mean, all seem possible to me, but, I was in the room and, sitting there, it was quite emotional. It was very raw. And I don't think it was calculated, or I don't think that this was some sort of messaging game. I think just a lot came to the surface for whatever reason when Kyle took those questions and started looking at his own future. And I think as a result, now I'm sitting here for the first time really thinking that he might be the one to leave the Leafs versus, a lot of the year I was wondering were the Leafs owners and upper management going to keep him.
Chris, why do you believe Shanahan wasn't there yesterday?
That's a tough one to answer. I think it's easy to say, well, because he doesn't have these answers himself. I mean, his primary responsibility is the direction of management. There's not a whole lot he can say at this point in time, but it's such a departure from the way the Leafs have done it in years gone by, where basically every year I remember at these sort of locker cleanout days or end of season availabilities, it's been Shanahan and Dubas presenting a united front, sitting side by side, talking about the trials and tribulations of the season. I mean, it was a notable absence. And, I'd like to think part of it is just that there's so much going on behind the scenes. I know there've been multiple meetings with the MLSE board involving, the top members of the organization. I think that there's a lot still to be resolved. It's probably cleaner and easier if you're in Brendan Shanahan's seat to have a path forward to discuss and a rationale to provide both the fans and media members about why certain decisions have been taken, where things are going before meeting reporters. But, the whole day was truly bizarre. It took about 7 hours roughly for the Leafs to wheel through all the availabilities. I mean, I don't have a stopwatch from the years gone by, but it's at least twice as long as that normally would play out. It felt very disorganized. It felt like everything's being made up on the fly. It felt like a lot was up in the air. And I think that that's emblematic of where this organization is today, that there's still so many moving parts and so little clarity that, maybe it's difficult for Brendan Shanahan to get out in front of the microphones because I don't think he's spoken publicly in a year. So when he does speak, it carries a lot more, his words carry a lot of weight because we don't hear them a lot. We don't get his thoughts or his views too often these days. And so I think when he speaks, he wants it to matter. And there's just too many hypotheticals right now.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't much fire yesterday, was there? The players said what they were supposed to say, it seemed. I remember when Messiah Jury spoke a week later after Nick Nurse was fired, he brought some fire with him, right? He wasn't happy. He was upset. He said, we need a big culture shift. We demand it. I know this was off for a number of months now. Do you think that's within Shanahan as well? Assuming he's staying, when he arrives at that podium in a couple of days' time, do you think you'll hear a similar type of attitude from a Shanahan? Has he got that within him? On the ice he did, but in the ballroom, does he?
Well, he certainly has it within him. I'd be surprised if he let it out of him in that setting. But, I was surprised, quite frankly, that Kyle Dubas was as raw and emotional as he was. So maybe, we're clearly at this big crossroads for the organization. And so basically whatever happens, I probably shouldn't be surprised at this point in time. Brendan is a pretty cool and collected guy. I think he's aware of his image, very conscious of delivering a message in a certain way. And so I'd be surprised if the fire came from him. I think ideally in this situation, you'd like to see a little bit more of it from the players. I look around the league, Nathan McKinnon a couple of years ago had a pretty emotional end of season press conference where he talked about, not having one diddly squat, but with harsher language than that in his 9 years in the league. And then of course he goes on and wins a Stanley Cup. We saw a lot of emotion out of Leon Draisaitl in Edmonton when their season fell short. I think you'd like to see more of that out of the Leafs players. I think quite frankly, that kind of tells you why we're going to see some change to the core of the team. I think the mix is just not quite right. And even while some on the outside have been saying that for a couple seasons, I think on the inside, they're starting to see that. There's just maybe a little complacency here. There seems to be, if we just take the players' comments on the surface, there seems to be this idea that they'll just naturally continue to get better, that 1 year it's going to come together, that they're on a path that's going to lead them where they want to go to. And I don't sense that fire. I don't see enough outward anger about, the fact that another opportunity slipped through their fingers. The fact that, look, they got by the first round, but it's a first round that wiped out Tampa Bay, Boston, the New York Rangers, Colorado on the western side of the draw. I mean, this was an incredible opportunity for this organization, and they frittered it away in 5 games. And I think there should have been more anger. I mean, the only piece of accountability publicly that we saw was Ryan O'Reilly, of all people, who spent, 30 games as a member of the team and is almost certainly going to leave as a free agent. I mean, he was saying he didn't produce enough. He didn't have enough chances, that he held himself to some account. No one else was doing that publicly. And I think it's a real sign of there needs a shock dropped in that dressing room. And I don't think, firing a head coach alone will do that. I mean, we've already seen that with Mike Babcock. I think there has to be some deeper change to try to draw a little bit more out of the team that remains.
Yeah, we're speaking with Chris Johnston. Chris, so he also mentioned that nothing is off the table in terms of what he could do with this group in the offseason, which obviously includes the core 4. Do you believe that also includes maybe trading Austin Matthews if they can't reach a deal?
Well, nothing is off the table to me means nothing is off the table. So that means for the first time that I'm aware of in this era of Leafs hockey, the Leafs front office will take a phone call on Austin Matthews or Mitch Marner or even William Nylander. They're going to explore what the returns could be for those players. And really, I don't think you don't enter that kind of period thinking we have to trade this one. I think what you do is you listen and get the information you can, and you evaluate what you think is the best overall move for the organization. Really what I'm talking about here is the return. And then in Austin Matthews' case, it's balanced against, what are we losing? What are we getting back? And what might we have to pay him? I don't really see the contract itself as a problem in Matthews' case. I think for all intents and purposes, he can almost name his number. Quite frankly, he's the one that's headed to unrestricted free agency. He gets a no movement clause on July 1st, meaning the organization can't just trade him anywhere. And even if they were to trade him today, just for argument's sake, I don't think too many teams would give up what it would take to even make that deal make sense without knowing that Austin Matthews wants to play there, that he'll sign an extension there. So really, I think Austin has his immediate future in his own hands. And, given that he's won a Hart Trophy, 2 Rocket Richards, a Ted Lindsay Award, is on pace really to perhaps go down as the greatest Leaf ever, as long as he can play more seasons in Toronto. I think he names his price. The Leafs have to decide, do they want to meet that price? Is it worth whatever it costs them in kind of the zero-sum game that the hard salary cap creates. And then, obviously what other teams are offering for their players will probably dictate where this ultimately goes.
What do
Yeah,
you think?
so.
Sorry, what do you think that number would be, Chris?
I think that I doubt he's going to sign a maximum length contract, which is 8 years, because we're moving into a period right now where the salary cap is actually going to start jumping up again. And so if you're him, why would you be guessing at what percentage you might be getting of the cap? So I think it's more than likely that they end up talking about a mid-range deal, whether that's 3 or 4 years. That's probably where the negotiation comes in. And then I think he's going to want to be the highest paid player by AAV, average of his contract, in the league. So, 13 million and change, 14 million. I think that's probably where you're getting to. But as I say, I really believe he can almost name his number. Now, there's limits to that, of course. If he says the maximum a player can be paid in the NHL is 20% of the cap. So if he came in and said he needs 17 million to make it work, well, it might be an easier decision for the Leafs. But, I do think he wants to be reasonable. If he stays in Toronto, keep in mind, he wants to win a Stanley Cup too. So it's about finding that right number that makes him properly respected or placed among his peers, that gives him the maximum window to maximize his long-term earnings and to help the Leafs have a chance to be competitive, because he doesn't want to be making a lot of money, but having his season end on April 10th.
The old cliche is, it's really hard to make a big deal to trade a great star player, right? I think it's a load of crap, quite frankly. There'd be 30 teams lining up for Mitch Marner or Willie Nylander. Tavares, not so much, perhaps. But, what is the easiest player to move, would you say, out of those two players? Is it Nylander because it's a smaller deal? Or is it Mitch Marner because he's a 100-point player? He's an absolute superstar.
I think Nylander is easier to move just because it's 1 year of commitment. It is a smaller contract, a little under 7 million on the cap, but you're obviously not getting as much back in that scenario either, because the team that's trading for him is assuming some risk with that. Mitch Marner is a hard player to move on a number of counts. He is an established superstar. He's got 2 more years of team control, which gives him more value, I would argue, in this circumstance, because anyone looking to trade for him wants to have him for as long as possible. And, for the Leafs, he's symbolic of something, right? He's a local kid. He's extremely popular among the fan base. Loves playing here, lives, year round in the Toronto/Muskoka region. He's truly is what you kind of dream of. If you remember the era prior to this one for the Leafs, it was always why do all the star players from the GTA have to go somewhere else and play and chase the Stanley Cup? I mean, Mitch Marner is the realization of a dream a lot of people have had about the Maple Leafs for a long time. And so I think that there's emotional, difficulties in making that trade. It doesn't mean it's the wrong trade to pursue. I think he probably brings you back the most in a return, certainly compared to Nylander. But that's a deal that whoever is making it, whether it's Kyle Dubas or someone else, like, you agonize over that for the period of time you're having those discussions, because it's very, very possible, if not likely, that you're going to regret it almost immediately. I mean, if Mitch Marner had 120 points next season playing somewhere else, that wouldn't surprise me in the least.
No, and it's going to be an incredible offseason. Chris Johnston, you've been phenomenal throughout these playoffs. We really appreciate you coming on here.
Well, I think we're going to have a lot more to talk about because this is the most interesting Leafs offseason I can remember in my career that spanned quite a long time around them. So I think that there's going to be some fireworks here in the next little while.